The first time Maribel came through Jonah Mercer's door, the wind shoved her halfway across his kitchen behind her. She caught the edge of the table to stay upright, rain running off her sleeves and bonnet strings, and looked at the shotgun in his hands as if it were no danger at all. Then she whispered, with thunder rolling hard enough to shake the crockery shelf, "I've never felt safer than with you." For one strange second, Jonah could do nothing but stare. Maribel lived on the next place over, across cottonwood scrub and split-rail fence. In 3 years of being neighbors, she had borrowed his post driver once, returned his pie tin twice, and mostly kept to the careful distance of a widow who had learned that silence drew less trouble than conversation. Now she stood in his kitchen with one boot missing, a bruise along her cheekbone, and an oilskin-wrapped ledger clutched to her chest. Jonah set the shotgun by the door only long enough to drop the bar into place. Then he moved the way he always moved when weather turned mean, fast, quiet, certain. He fed the stove 2 splits of pine, checked the east shutter before the hinge could tear free, and whistled once toward the lean-to. Outside, his geldings stopped hammering at the stall wall at once. When he turned back, Mara was still standing exactly where the storm had left her, though her knees had begun to shake. "Sit," he said. "I can't stay." "You can sit and still leave later." That seemed to catch her off guard. She lowered herself into the chair by the stove, folding around her fear like a woman trying to make herself take up less room than she already did. Jonah knelt to look at her bare foot. She flinched hard enough to scrape the chair leg backward. He stopped immediately. "Splinter," he said. "Nothing more." After a breath, she nodded. Her heel was cut from shale. He cleaned it with hot water from the kettle while rain lashed the windows. The bruise on her face had finger marks in it. Jonah's jaw tightened. "Who put hands on you?" he asked. She looked down at the book. "Silas Creed sent Ezra Pell to search my house. Ezra got angry when I wouldn't tell him where my husband kept his papers. Gideon's been dead near a year." "Yes. Men don't ride through a storm for old receipts." "No." Her fingers tightened on the oilskin. "They ride for this. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and if you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It always feels warmer when we know who's gathered close to the fire." Jonah held out his hand. She did not give him the book. Outside, through the howl of weather, came the faint clatter of hooves. Both of them heard it. Jonah rose, took down the shotgun again, and crossed to the window. Through a slit in the curtain, he counted 3 riders coming up through the yard with their heads bent against the rain. Ezra Pell rode in front, broad in the shoulders, wearing the pleased look of a man who mistakes cruelty for strength. Behind him came Newt Garrick and a younger hand Jonah did not know. Mara stood so fast the chair scraped. "I'll go out," she whispered. "If they find me here, he'll take your place same as mine." Jonah kept his eyes on the riders. "You run half barefoot through a killing storm to get here, and now you think I'll hand you over dry? You don't know what he wants. Then tell me after I send him off my porch." The pounding on the door shook the shelf. "Mercer," Ezra shouted. "Open up." Jonah lifted the bar and opened the door only enough to see them clearly. Rain slashed his face. Ezra leaned from the saddle, grinning. "We're looking for Mrs. Bell," he said. "So am I," Jonah replied. "Figure if she's got sense, she's under a roof." Ezra's gaze slid toward the dark interior. "Mr. Creed says she's carrying property that belongs to him." "Mr. Creed says a great many things." Newt laughed once, ugly and short. Ezra settled deeper in the saddle. "You'd best not make this troublesome." Jonah let the door open 1 inch wider, so Ezra could see the shotgun in his hand. "Trouble's already here. It's dripping on my porch." For a moment, the only sound was hail striking the trough. Then Ezra spat into the mud. "We'll search at first light," he said. "You bring paper for that search, or are you still pretending Creed is the law?" Ezra's smile vanished. "Careful, Mercer." Jonah shut the door in his face. He dropped the bar back into place and stood listening until the hoofbeats faded. Mara had not moved. In the stove glow her eyes looked enormous. "If they come back with the sheriff?" she asked. "Then I'll ask the sheriff for paper too." "That won't save you." "No," he said, "but it'll slow them down." He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Then he held out his hand again. This time she gave him the ledger. Inside were pages of figures in Gideon Bell's careful hand. Freight charges, cattle tallies, bridge timber accounts, loan notes, land transfers. Gideon had kept books for Silas Creed's cattle company before he died in what Red Bluff called a drowning and Mara never called anything at all. Jonah turned 3 pages and felt the room go still around him. There, entered between timber payments and freight charges, was county money appropriated for repairs on the Sweetwater crossing. Beside it, Gideon had written in tiny script, "Paid to Creed. No repairs made." The same crossing where the doctor's wagon had broken an axle while trying to reach Jonah's wife. The same crossing Jonah had cursed in his sleep for years. Mara saw the change in his face. "There's more," she said. "Widow's notes. False interest. Deeds signed after the signers were already buried." Gideon copied what he could because he was afraid. "I found the ledger tonight behind the flour bin when Ezra started tearing up the kitchen." Jonah looked again at the bridge entry. At the date. At the neat bite of Gideon's pen where truth had been pressed into paper by a frightened man with no one to save him. The storm had brought Mara to his door. The book in his hands had brought the rest of his life with her. By dawn there was no road back to the world as it had been. Mara tried to leave just after sunup. Jonah came in from clearing a branch off the well sweep and found her at the back door with the ledger under one arm and his coat folded over the other. She had washed her face in cold water and braided her hair into something firm enough to pass for resolve. "I won't have him ruin you for my sake," she said. Jonah took the coat, hung it on the peg again, and set the coffee pot between them. "Drink first." "Jonah, drink." She sat. He poured. The kitchen smelled of chicory, wet wool, and pine smoke. After a while she said, "Creed owns the note on your place now. Ezra told me so, just to be cruel. If Creed learns you sheltered me, he'll call it default and put you off before first snow. He's held my note 6 months and hasn't managed to move me yet. Because you keep your head down." "Yes. And because I made sure your payments reached the right ledger instead of disappearing into his." Jonah looked up. Mara lowered her eyes to the steam rising from her cup. "After Gideon died, Creed left me in the company house long enough to finish the season books. Long enough, I think, to enjoy what fear does to a person. I learned where he hid things. I learned who he was stealing from. I learned your land should have been free and clear last autumn." A heat spread through Jonah's chest that had nothing to do with coffee. "You fixed my books." "I delayed what I could. Burned one notice and told the clerk it never came. It wasn't charity. Your wife brought broth when Gideon broke his arm. She stayed all afternoon and never once acted put upon. Some debts sit where money can't reach them." That was the first time Anna had entered the room between them, and Mara had done it gently. Jonah set down his cup. "The doctor never made it because the bridge failed," he said. "I used to think that was weather. Then I thought it was me. Now I'm wondering if it was theft." Mara's face softened. "I'm sorry." He nodded. He had no words broad enough for that kind of sorrow. After a while she said, "The ledger starts questions. It does not hang him. Gideon hid a tin box under the floor of our well house. Deeds. Copies. A letter, maybe. If Creed gets that box first, all of this turns to smoke." The easy path sat plain before Jonah. Saddle her horse. Send her west to an aunt near Rollins. Keep his land. Keep his quiet. Go on with the narrow life grief had left him. The hard path meant Creed would stop circling and come straight in. He looked at Mara's bruised face, at the way she held herself ready for flight, and at the ledger that had reached across years to lay a hand on his dead wife's memory. "I'm going with you," he said. Her head lifted. "Why?" He thought of all the years he had spent surviving by becoming smaller than his own anger. "Because I'm too old to start living with myself any worse than I already do." Something moved in her face then. Not relief exactly. Relief's gentler cousin. They went first to Nora Pike's store because Jonah trusted Nora more than he trusted most preachers and all elected men. She was a broad woman with iron gray hair braided around her head and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind one ear. When Mara stepped in beside Jonah, Nora's hand paused over the molasses barrel. Her gaze took in the bruise, the ledger, and the fact that Jonah Mercer had walked into town in daylight with trouble at his side and no intention of pretending otherwise. "Well," Nora said, "that looks like the sort of mourning that won't improve by lying." "No," Mara answered. Nora bolted the door. They told her enough. Nora laid out paper, lampblack, and envelopes. While Mara copied the worst entries in her fine, steady hand, Nora wrapped biscuits in cloth and listened with the grave patience of a woman who had already seen half the valley harmed by men with polished boots. When good people get cornered, Nora said at last, the devil always counts on them staying polite. Mara did not look up. I was polite for almost a year. And did it ease him any? No. Jonah watched Mara's pen move over the page. She wrote like a person who believed marks ought to mean exactly what they claimed. At the end of the counter, he said quietly, there are worse hungers than an empty table. Being afraid in your own house is one of them. Mara's hand stilled above the page. It was such a small line he barely knew he'd said it, but Nora heard, and so did the old rancher buying nails near the stove. Truth often traveled that way in places like Red Bluff, not as speeches, but as sentences that settled into people and waited. By noon the town was already leaning toward rumor. 2 boys by the livery stopped their game to watch Mara cross the street. Reverend Sloan polished his spectacles. Deputy Harlan Voss kept tugging his left cuff as if it might hide how much of him belonged to Silas Creed. At the sheriff's office, they found Sheriff Amos Tiller eating boiled eggs with salt. He was a thick man with patient eyes and patient corruption, the sort who liked to sound sorrowful while doing wrong. Jonah laid 1 copy of the ledger on his desk. We need safe conduct to Judge Rowe's hearing tomorrow. Tiller did not touch the paper. What's this? Enough for him to read. What I see, Tiller said, is a grieving widow and a man who's stepped into business bigger than himself. Mara's voice came quiet and flat. My husband kept books for Silas Creed. These are those books. Tiller finally glanced down. His face changed almost imperceptibly, which told Jonah he knew exactly what he was seeing. Then he pushed the copy back. You should both go home, he said. Put this foolishness down before it brings pain. So that's your counsel? Jonah asked. It's my kindness. Keep it. Tiller sighed. Creed has made complaint that company records were stolen. He's entitled to recover property. By sending a hand to strike a woman? Mara asked. The sheriff spread his hands. Can't testify to what I didn't witness. No, she said. Only to what you're paid to miss. That landed. When they stepped back into the street, the town felt smaller and meaner. Creed's power lay in the bank, the freight yard, the sheriff's office, the mercantile where half the valley bought flour on credit. You could not pull one root of him without feeling the rest hold fast underground. At Nora's porch, Jonah tightened his saddle cinch and said, if we don't return by dawn tomorrow, ring the church bell until the whole town comes. Bring every widow whose name appears in that ledger. Nora's mouth flattened. I was going to do that anyway. By late afternoon, the sky had gone green over the valley. Jonah and Mara rode the dry wash toward her place, keeping low among rabbit brush and cut banks. Mara rode stiff because of her foot. Jonah rode half a horse length ahead, reading the ground the way other men read letters. 3 riders passed here an hour ago, he said. How can you tell? He pointed to a bent clump of grama grass still weeping sap. Because the stem hasn't dried. Because one horse drags his right toe. Because somebody up ahead is impatient and believes the earth forgets him. Mara looked at him with something like wonder, and it embarrassed him only because he had forgotten he knew how to do anything worth being noticed for. When her blue-trimmed house came into view, Ezra's wagon stood in the yard. Smoke drifted behind the barn. Men's voices carried on the wind. Jonah and Mara crouched behind the well curb. 4, Jonah murmured. Ezra, Newt, the boy from last night, and Creed himself. Mara's breath caught. He came, in your yard like he owns the sunset. From the porch, Creed's voice floated smooth as lamp oil. Search the pantry again. Gideon was too frightened a man to trust his luck to one hiding place. Jonah saw Mara close her eyes once, then open them harder. The box is under the well house floor. 3rd board from the north wall. Can you run if I buy you time? She gave him a look almost offended. I can pry up a board and carry a tin box. The rest we'll discover. What would you have done in her place? Run while there was still road left, or go back for the truth knowing it might bury you with it? Sometimes the next step tells you who you have been all along. They circled through the kitchen garden with the collapsed chicken pen between themselves and the porch. At the well house, Jonah paused, listening. Creed was in the main room. Ezra was at the barn. For one breath, the yard had no eyes on it. They slipped inside. The well house smelled of damp wood and old iron. Mara knelt at once, counted boards with her fingertips, and wedged Jonah's knife beneath the 3rd. It lifted with a sigh. Beneath it lay a tin box no bigger than a Bible. She hauled it free. Bootsteps hit the threshold. Jonah shoved her behind the barrel just as Ezra filled the doorway. "Mercer," he said, grinning. "Well now." Jonah hit him before the grin finished landing. He drove low and hard, smashing Ezra backward into the wall. The hanging lamp broke and kerosene splashed across the floorboards. Mara ran. Newt shouted from the yard. Creed barked an order. Jonah snatched at Ezra's wrist, slammed it against the frame, and heard the revolver strike the floor. Then Newt was in the doorway with a rifle and no room to aim. Jonah kicked the lamp base into his legs. Newt stumbled. Mara burst past with the tin box under one arm and vanished into the rising dust beyond. After her, Creed roared. Jonah lunged for the rifle. Newt swung the stock down instead. It caught Jonah above the shoulder with a blaze of white pain. He seized the barrel and twisted. The shot tore into the roof. Light splintered through the boards. Ezra came from behind and locked an arm around Jonah's throat. For one terrible second, Jonah saw nothing but the dirt floor rushing up. Then he stamped backward, drove both men into the rotted planks around the well casing, and the floor beneath them gave way. Wood cracked. The world dropped out. He hit hard in blackness. Something struck his temple. Above him, men shouted. Nearby, water dripped in slow, patient beats, as if the earth itself were counting down to something final. He opened his eyes to matchlight and Mara saying his name. They were in an old root cellar under the well house, half buried in dirt and splintered boards. Ezra lay senseless beside the fallen barrel. Jonah's shoulder burned wet and hot where the rifle ball had grazed through. Rain leaked through the broken floor overhead. Mara was on her knees beside him, one hand shaking around the match, the other pressed to his wound. "The bullet passed through, I think," she said. "I'm trying not to faint because it would be inconvenient." A laugh escaped him despite the pain. "That's better," she whispered, and he realized she had been afraid of silence. Above them came Creed's voice, sharp with fury, then the first hard drops of storm striking the broken boards overhead. "Open the box," Jonah said. Inside lay folded deeds, sworn statements, receipts tied with black thread, and a letter in Gideon Bell's hand addressed simply, "For whoever is still willing to stand upright." Mara unfolded it. Gideon named Silas Creed. He named the false interest added to widows' loans, the county bridge money stolen and entered as freight expense, the sheriff paid to look away, the deputy used as a runner. In the last lines, pressed dark where the pen had bitten deep, he wrote that if he was found drowned below the cut bank, he had not gone there by choice. When Mara finished reading, she closed her eyes. "They killed him," she said. Jonah had suspected. Seeing it in Gideon's own hand turned suspicion into iron. "Yes." She let out a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "The cruelest part is that he wasn't brave near the end." He stuttered when Creed entered a room. He spilled coffee. He slept with one boot on. But he wrote this anyway. "Courage and fear have never been strangers," Jonah said. The rain came harder. Above them, men moved across the broken boards and then away, searching the yard. The cellar was close, damp, alive with the smell of wet earth and blood and lamp oil. Mara pressed a torn strip of petticoat harder against his shoulder. "I am so tired," she said quietly, "of being brave where nobody is kind." That was the truest thing spoken that night. Jonah reached into his vest and drew out the small iron key he wore on a thong under his shirt. The back door key to his house. He put it in her palm. "If I fail to get you out," he said, "that opens my back door, the feed room, and the storm cellar. Take the house. Take the horse. Take every jar in the root cellar and don't apologize for any of it." She stared at the key as if it weighed more than iron should. "Why would you give me that?" He looked at her properly then, with mud on her hem and Gideon's last letter in her lap and rainwater tracing lines through the dirt above them. "Because when you came through my door, you said you'd never felt safer than with me. I haven't made peace with much in this life. But if that one thing was true, I'd like to be worthy of it." Her mouth trembled. "Some doors aren't locked to keep people out," she said. "Some are locked so grief has somewhere to sit. I think yours has been sitting there alone too long." He had no answer large enough for that, so he gave her the only true one he had. "You don't owe me your easy parts, Mara," he said. "The hurt ones will do." For a long moment, she only looked at him. Then, very carefully, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "If this story is moving you, then you are exactly who it was written for. A like and a subscribe tell us to keep making room for this kind of tenderness. When she drew back, something in Jonah felt less locked than it had the hour before. They waited until the storm moved east, and the yard above them went quiet. Ezra woke once with a curse. Jonah relieved him of his belt and tied his wrists with it. Near dawn, when the mud loosened enough to shift the fallen planks, Jonah braced his good shoulder and shoved upward. Mara shoved beside him. The cellar exhaled cold morning into their faces. Creed and his men were gone. They washed at the pump, bound Jonah's wound tighter, hid Gideon's papers, and rode for town. Judge Alton Rowe held circuit hearings in the room above the mercantile. By the time Jonah and Mara arrived, half the town stood at the hitch rail or crowded the boardwalk, drawn by rumor the way crows gather over turned soil. Nora Pike waited on the porch in her black Sunday dress. Beside her stood 3 widows from the South Draw, Old Hamley from the freight yard, Reverend Sloan, and 2 farmers whose acreage had been thinned by winter notes that always seemed to grow new teeth. When Nora saw them alive, something hard in her face eased. "I rang the bell anyway," she said. "Good," Jonah answered. Upstairs, the hearing room smelled of damp coats and paper. Judge Rowe was lean and road-worn. Sheriff Tiller stood near the wall with his hands folded over his middle. Deputy Voss worked at his left cuff. Silas Creed stood by the front table in a dark coat that had never known weather enough to matter. His eyes went to Mara first, then to Jonah's bandaged shoulder. A brief flare of annoyance crossed his face and vanished. "Well," Creed said smoothly, "Mrs. Bell, Mr. Mercer, we feared the storm had delayed your common sense." Mara stepped forward before Jonah could answer. "My husband kept books for you," she said. "I have brought them." A murmur moved through the room. Creed smiled. "You have brought stolen company records and a story born of grief." "No," Mara said. "I have brought your theft written in my husband's hand, and his last letter in case your memory should fail." Judge Rowe extended his hand. Mara gave him the ledger and Gideon's letter. The room went still enough that Jonah could hear water dripping from somebody's coat hem onto the floor. Rowe read longer than people expected a powerful man to be made to wait. Halfway through, his eyes sharpened. At the bridge entry, they hardened. "Is there a reason," the judge asked, "that county funds intended for the Sweetwater crossing appear here as private disbursement?" "Clerical error," Creed replied. "And the notes charging widows interest after death?" "Bookkeeper's confusion." And this statement from Gideon Bell asserting that if he was found drowned it would not be by choice. A frightened man's rambling. Jonah saw the judge's patience cool by degrees. He also saw Creed begin to lean on the trick that had carried him for years, that if he told a lie calmly enough, everybody decent would feel impolite calling it one. That was when Nora Pike stepped forward with her copies. Then Mrs. Hanley. Then Lorna Fitch. Then May Holloway with her little boy clutching her skirt. One by one they named the notes called on their land, the fees that appeared without warning, the dates that did not fit, the signatures taken when dying men could barely lift a hand. With each voice the room changed. Not loudly, but undeniably. The old habit of silence began to split. Creed's gaze snapped to Mara. "You should have left that box buried where Gideon hid it under the well house." The words were out before he heard them leave him. Mara did not blink. "Strange," she said softly. "I never told the judge where it was hidden." Silence followed with edges on it. Creed recovered fast, but not fast enough. "Everyone knew Bell tinkered in that shack." "No," Jonah said. His voice carried farther than he expected because he had spent too many years not using it. "Not everyone. Only a man who put fear in Gideon Bell would know where Gideon thought to hide from it." Judge Rowe closed the ledger. "Sheriff, you will secure Mr. Creed and his records pending state review." Nobody moved. That was the heart of corruption laid plain, not wickedness with guns drawn, but the certainty that the right order would never be obeyed if the wrong man was rich enough. Creed smiled again, though now it looked carved on. "With respect, Your Honor, there are decent men in this room who know the difference between bookkeeping under strain and slander stirred by a hysterical widow." He should have stopped there. Instead, he reached for Mara's arm. Jonah was between them before the contact fully happened. He did not draw his gun. He simply caught Creed's wrist and held it. And there was so much unspent life in the grip of that quiet man that Creed's face changed for the first time into something honest. "You don't touch her," Jonah said. Creed's voice dropped. "You think this room will save you?" Jonah thought of the failed bridge. of Anna dying with his hand in hers, of Mara in his doorway saying she had never felt safer. Of every day he had chosen silence, because silence seemed cheaper than another loss. "No," he said. "I think this room will finally hear us." Creed yanked free and went for the pistol under his coat. Mara did not scream. She seized the edge of the hearing table and drove it hard into his knees. He stumbled. Jonah hit him shoulder first, pain tearing white down his wounded arm, and both men crashed against the iron stove. Creed's pistol skidded under the judge's chair. Tiller swore. Boss backed away. Someone shouted from the stairwell. Creed was strong in the decorative way of men who make others labor for them. Jonah was strong in the older way of shovel handles, and Winters survived. He took Creed once in the ribs, once across the mouth, and when Creed clawed for the pistol, Jonah stamped his hand flat to the floorboards. "Do it then," Jonah said, loud enough for the doorway and the stairs and everyone listening below. "Reach for violence in daylight, in front of every name you stole from. Let them see the whole of you." Creed looked up at the room around him, at Nora, at the widows, at Judge Rowe's face gone hard, at the farmers filling the doorway now that courage had become catching. He saw, maybe for the first time in his life, that fear had changed sides. He sagged then, only a little, but enough. Judge Rowe stooped, picked up the pistol himself, and handed it to Reverend Sloane, who nearly dropped it from surprise. "Sheriff," Rowe said, each word cut clean, "I will not repeat myself." Tiller looked at Creed, then at the room, then at his own badge as though it had grown unexpectedly heavy. With the whole town watching, he did the only thing left available to a coward who hoped later to claim he had always meant to do right. He stepped forward and put Silas Creed in irons. The breath that went through the room after that felt like a season breaking. Everything else took weeks, but from that hour the ending had already changed hands. State auditors came from Cheyenne. The bank's books were opened. Fraudulent notes were voided. Land taken through false interest returned to the families squeezed off it. Sheriff Tiller resigned before he could be fully removed and was later convicted with Deputy Voss. Ezra Pell and Newt Garrick turned on Creed the moment they understood his money would not save them. Gideon Bell's death was reopened and no longer called accidental. The Sweetwater Bridge was rebuilt proper that autumn with county lumber washed by too many angry eyes to vanish again. Jonah stood on the far bank the day the final beam went in and felt something unclench in him that had been tight for so long he had mistaken it for bone. Mara got her house back. She also got every apology Red Bluff knew how to make, better in deeds than in words. Mrs. Hanley brought peach preserves. Reverend Sloane fixed her gate without being asked. 2 boys from the livery whitewashed the porch where Ezra's boot heels had scarred it. Nora Pike brought her a rosebush and said, "Don't let men like that teach you to grow only thorns." As for Jonah, the town looked at him differently, and he bore it with the same discomfort he bore new boots. Praise sat oddly on him. Respect fit better. He did not ask Mara to return his key. She did not give it back. The frost came thin and silver that year. One evening Mara walked into Jonah's kitchen with a basket of mending and found him standing over a loaf gone badly wrong. "It appears," he said gravely, "that grief taught me carpentry but not bread." She laughed, took the spoon from his hand, and set about rescuing what could be rescued. He built up the fire. The kettle began to sing. Outside, darkness settled blue over the pasture. At some point their shoulders brushed while reaching for the same tin of salt, and neither of them stepped away. "Funny thing about peace," Mara said, eyes on the dough. "It doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes like bread in a warm kitchen, and one day you realize you've stopped bracing for the knock." He looked at her with the sort of stillness a man reaches only after a long war with himself. "Stay," he said, "tonight, for as many nights as feel like truth." So she did. By spring they had cut a gate in the fence between the 2 places, and before long it stood open more often than shut. Mara kept her blue-trimmed house and turned Gideon's old bookkeeping room into a little office where she helped neighbors read contracts before signing them. Jonah repaired barns, built cupboards, and took on fewer solitary jobs because supper waited now and he found he preferred being expected. A year later, with the cottonwoods full and green again, Nora Pike pretended not to cry at their wedding supper and failed. Months after that, on an evening smelling of cut hay and yeast, Mara pulled a loaf from Jonah's oven while he came in from the barn with sawdust on his sleeves and the back door key she had once clutched in a cellar now hanging beside her own by the pantry. Peace, they discovered, was work shared, grief named without shame, and love strong enough to make a house feel larger than fear. Beyond the open kitchen window, the pasture rolled soft beneath the sinking sun, and their two homes stood with the gate between them wide as welcome while lamplight gathered gold against the glass. And next time, settle in with us for the story of the deaf seamstress left at a mountain stage stop because her brothers were ashamed of her, and the wounded former marshal who learned her silence carried more truth than any courtroom he had ever stood in.